Snooker in the 1970s was dying a slow death in smoky working men's clubs across Britain. Then something magical happened that nobody saw coming. Colour television arrived, and suddenly this obscure cue sport became the perfect match for the new technology. The vibrant reds, yellows and blues looked absolutely stunning on the new colour screens. But what they really needed were personalities. They needed heroes and villains. They needed drama. And there enter two men who would create the greatest rivalry snooker has ever known and transform a dying gentleman's game into television gold. Steve Davis arrived on the professional scene in 1978 like a man with a mission. This ginger-haired kid from Romford had been raised on snooker since he could barely see over the table. His father Bill had fed him a steady diet of practice, practice, and more practice, using the legendary Joe Davis handbook as their Bible. Davis was the first true professional in snooker history. While other players treated the game as a part-time hobby, Davis approached it like a full-time job. He practiced 8 hours a day, studied every angle, and turned winning into a science. His manager, Barry Hearn, saw something special in this quiet, methodical young man. Hearn called him the Nugget because you could bet your money on him and know you would get paid. Davis was consistent and utterly ruthless when it came to winning matches. But there was a problem. Davis was also incredibly boring to watch. He played percentage snooker, taking the safe option every time. While crowds craved excitement and flair, Davis gave them mathematical precision. He was so methodical that the satirical show Spitting Image nicknamed him Steve Interesting Davis. The audience respected his skill, but couldn't connect with his personality. Then along came the complete opposite. Alex Higgins burst onto the scene like a force of nature. Higgins had learned his craft in the rough working men's clubs of Northern Ireland. He was small, wiry, and moved around the table like lightning. When other players took their time lining up shots, Higgins would be potting balls before you could blink. But it wasn't just his speed that made him special. Higgins had an almost supernatural ability to see shots that other players couldn't even imagine. He would attempt pots that seemed impossible and somehow make them look easy. Off the table, Higgins was equally unpredictable. He chain-smoked, drank heavily, and had a temper that could explode without warning. He headbutted officials, threatened other players, and generally treated professional snooker like his personal playground. Barry Hearn's matchroom venue in Romford became the unlikely setting for some of the most legendary encounters in snooker history. Hearn would bring all the top players down to challenge his golden boy Davis. But nobody drew crowds like Alex Higgins. When the Hurricane walked into the matchroom, the atmosphere would change completely. The crowd would be rowdy, partisan, and totally biased against Davis. They would shout and jeer during his shots, creating the kind of hostile environment that would break most players. But Davis thrived on it. Higgins would arrive asking what odds he could get on himself, often betting his entire appearance fee on the outcome. Win or lose, he would usually need to borrow money for his bus fare home. But he'd always return because he couldn't resist the chance to entertain a crowd. One legendary match lasted 4 days and nights, a best of 65 frames marathon that people still talk about today. Davis led by massive margins, but Higgins would always find a way to make it interesting. The snooker was incredible, but the psychological warfare was even better. When snooker moved to the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield in 1977, it found its perfect home. This intimate venue with its steep seating created an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in sport. Davis won his first world title in 1981, beating Doug Mountjoy in a final that announced his arrival as snooker's new dominant force. He was just 23 years old, but already played with the composure of a veteran. Higgins had won his first world championship back in 1972, but that was in a different era. By the time the Crucible became snooker's spiritual home, many people wondered if the Hurricane still had what it took to win the big one. The answer came in spectacular fashion in 1982. Higgins stormed through the tournament like a man possessed. In the semi-final against Jimmy White, he faced match point trailing 15-14 and 59-0 down. What happened next became the stuff of legend. With the table in a seemingly impossible position, Higgins somehow cleared up with a break of 69 that defied logic and physics. The shots he played were outrageous, which shouldn't have been possible even with heavier balls and slower table conditions. In the final against Ray Reardon, Higgins completed his fairy tale with an 18-15 victory. But it was the celebration that really captured the public's imagination. When Higgins potted the winning ball, he collapsed in tears.
Fantastic.
As his wife Lynn and baby daughter Lauren rushed onto the stage. That image of the wild man of snooker breaking down with joy while holding his family became one of the most iconic moments in sports history. It showed that underneath all the chaos and controversy, Higgins was just a man who desperately wanted to prove he could be the best. With both men now established as world champions, the rivalry took on a whole new dimension. Every time they met, it felt like a clash of philosophies about how the game should be played. The 1983 UK Championship final at Preston Guildhall became the stage for one of their most memorable encounters. Davis had been dominating snooker all year and was expected to win easily. He raced to a 7-0 lead that seemed to put the match beyond doubt. But Higgins had other ideas. Slowly but surely, the Hurricane began to claw his way back into the match. By the evening session, Higgins had leveled the match at 8-8. The crowd was going absolutely wild, sensing they were witnessing something special. Higgins moved ahead 14-12, then saw Davis fighting back to lead 15-14. But in those crucial final moments, the Hurricane found the composure to win the last 2 frames and complete one of the greatest comebacks in snooker history. The victory meant everything to Higgins. It proved he could match Davis when it really mattered. For Davis, it was a painful lesson about never counting out a genius, even when logic suggested the match was over. But that defeat only made Davis more determined. He used disappointment as fuel to reach even greater heights. Throughout the mid-1980s, he dominated snooker like few players have ever dominated any sport. Davis won 6 world championships between 1981 and 1989, establishing himself as the greatest winner in snooker history. What made Davis special was his understanding that snooker was as much a mental game as a physical one. The public still preferred Higgins, but they had to respect what Davis was achieving. He was turning snooker into a serious sport with serious money. When Davis won his final world title in 1989, the £105,000 prize money was actually more than what golf's Open champion earned that same year. Davis had proven that dedication and professionalism could overcome natural talent and crowd appeal. He had turned himself from a boring outsider into snooker's most successful player ever. Sadly, Higgins couldn't match Davis's longevity. The lifestyle that made him such a compelling character eventually became his downfall. The drinking, smoking, and chaotic personal life that entertained crowds also destroyed his ability to compete at the highest level. By the late 1980s, Higgins was struggling to qualify for major tournaments. The man who had once been world champion was reduced to playing in dingy venues for tiny prize money. His last meaningful victory came at the 1989 Irish Masters, beating a young Stephen Hendry in what felt like a changing of the guard. The final blow came in 1990 when Higgins made death threats against Dennis Taylor during a team event. The sport he had helped create could no longer tolerate his behavior. He was banned for a season and never really recovered. Higgins's decline was as dramatic as his rise. The genius who had captivated millions ended up broke, alone, and battling serious health problems. He died in 2010 at just 61 years old, a shadow of the vibrant performer who had once owned every room he entered. But here's the thing about legacies. They're not always about who lived the longest or earned the most money. They're about impact and influence. Davis and Higgins together created something that had never existed before in sport. They turned snooker from a niche pastime into must-watch television that dominated British culture for an entire decade. Today's players like Ronnie O'Sullivan acknowledge the debt they owe to Higgins and Davis. O'Sullivan has said repeatedly that without Higgins, snooker would never have become the global sport it is today. Modern players are more skilled than ever before. The standard of play is higher, the prize money is bigger, and the tournaments are more professional. But something has been lost along the way. Davis proved that dedication and professionalism could create champions. Higgins showed that personality and flair could create legends. Together, they demonstrated that sport needs both elements to truly capture people's hearts and minds. And that's how two men from opposite ends of the personality spectrum took a dying game and turned it into television gold that still shines today. That's a wrap on today's video. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and for more snooker content, click the screen below.